say welcome. My name is Joseph Orozco. I am a professor here in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And along with Tony Vogt, I am one of the co-directors of the Inaris Project for Alternative Futures. And we want to thank you today for coming to one of the final forums for the Inaris Project this year. The Inaris Project is a project here in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion that's inspired by the speculative fiction of Oregon science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin. And it's a project that seeks to bring together activists and scholars from the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences that are writing, thinking, and teaching about the ideas and themes that are explored in Ursula K. Le Guin's writings, including gender, racial, sexual justice, ecological sustainability, bioregionalism, anarchist traditions, utopia and dystopias, alternatives to war, cooperative economic arrangements, and indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. So for this panel today, I want to thank some folks before we get started. I want to thank, first of all, our director, Ben Wichler, for helping to okay this to go ahead. Thank also Susan Shaw, the director of the School of Languages, Culture, and Society, for her input. And also thank our friend Lilith Magdalene for helping getting the personnel to set up for this panel. This panel was inspired by a conversation that I had a couple of months ago with one of our panelists, Nicole von Gertmanton, and we were talking about new directions in the study of sex work and sex work activism. And we wanted to try to explore these new directions a little bit more carefully in a panel. And so we decided to have folks get together to start talking about new directions in the study of sex work. There's a classical radical feminist critique of sex work that says that under conditions of patriarchy, any valorization of sex work contributes to the oppression of women as a group, and that notions of consent or of empowerment through sex work are impossible because of institutionalized misogyny. A movement is now growing that responds to this line of thought, and it seeks to put sex work in the context of labor theory and of human rights struggle. And while it does not deny that there is patriarchal oppression, it seeks to put attention on the testimony of sex workers themselves to understand the kinds of agency that they enact through their work. And so today we have three people on our panel. Two of them are coming into us virtually, and to talk a little bit about these new directions in sex work. So the lineup for today, the first speaker is Phoenix Khalida. Phoenix is a sex worker who lives near Chicago, and she's worked in the industry for almost a decade, and she also works as a sex workers' rights activist. Our second panelist, also coming into us from the Bay Area in California, is Sabrina Morgan, who is a sex worker and works as a sex educator and human rights advocate. And then finally, to sum up some of this work and lead us into a discussion, will be Professor Nicole von Gertmanton, who is Associate Professor of History here at OSU. And she is author of the book Violent Delights, Violent Ends, Sex, Race, and Honor in Colonial Cartagena de Indias, which examines the ways that Spanish women use their sexuality to negotiate power and status in colonial Latin America. So we'll have about 12 minutes or so for each of the panelists to talk a little bit, and I've asked them to address certain kinds of questions about the nature of sex work and what they themselves do and how they see their agency. And then we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So I first want to introduce you to Phoenix, and I'll turn this over to her to speak a little bit. Phoenix, it's all yours.
All right, thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As you heard, I am a sex worker. I've been doing sex work for about 10 years. I live right outside Chicago in the suburbs, and I like what I do, quite honestly. I have found that sex work for me personally is relatively empowering. I find sex work to be a really great way for me to be able to find a certain amount of agency. I'm coming from, I think, a very unique perspective in my own life because I am a single mom, because I am not white, because sexually I identify as queer. So I'm in a position where it's very difficult for me to find agency the vast majority of the time. I am in a very marginalized and disenfranchised part of society. So for me, it's incredibly important to find something where I can make enough money to support myself and to support my children, but also feel like I'm okay at the end of the day. I don't want to have to hate myself. I don't want to have to feel that I don't have any control over what I'm doing. I don't want to feel that I don't have any kind of control over my future. And for me personally, I find I'm able to meet a lot of these goals with sex work as an occupation. You know, a lot of people find that when it comes to sex work, there's the assumption that everyone who's in it is trafficked, everyone who's in it is underage, everyone who's in it is forced and wants to leave. But the truth is there's a lot of people, mostly women, because most sex workers are women, but there are some men and non-gender binary folks. There are some of us who really enjoy what we do because it gives us opportunities that we wouldn't normally have. For me, what I find is that it's really empowering to be able to tell a client no. If someone approaches me for services I don't want to give them, I can say no. If someone is offering me money for services and I don't find the money is sufficient, I can say no. If I'm not able to go to work today because my kids are sick, that's okay. I don't have to try to justify it to my boss. So in that sense, there's a lot of freedom that I would not normally have. I don't have a college degree. I would have to be working in a basic 9-to-5 kind of job without a lot of seniority. So taking off time for my health, because I have a lot of health issues, taking off time to do things with my children as they need is just not something that's feasible for me. So this is the best fit that I found for me. And I think that it's important too to realize that a lot of feminist critique I've found about ending sex work tends to parallel current ideas that are already being established under patriarchy. And a lot of it, the critique around sex work feels as though what we're trying to do is shame sex workers for being sexual people, predominantly women who are charging a service and making a profit for what they're doing. And I would argue that sex workers can be some of the best feminists and some of the best people to help dismantle the patriarchy, because we are ultimately doing everything that patriarchy tells us not to do. Not only are we women, not only are we financially independent, we are doing it on our own terms and maintaining our own agency and using our own sexuality as we choose to do, which is incredibly important. That's the type of freedom that I personally find in sex work. Not everyone feels the same way, obviously, but that's how I feel about what I do. I just wanted to address a couple quick things when it comes to decriminalization versus the idea of having sex work legalized. Where I'm at, I think that decriminalization would be a better choice. Some people want to suggest that within the sex work world that legalizing and have the government keeping control of things and offering licenses for brothels and keeping track of sex workers is the most effective way to go. But again, coming from my perspective, in and outside of sex work, as a non-white woman who has lived in very poor urban areas, I don't trust government officials and police to necessarily have my best interest at heart. I feel safest knowing that what I was doing was decriminalized, and if something happened to me, I could report to police. I think that would be the ultimate freedom, is being able to report if something does happen, because I can't lie, sex work is a very dangerous profession, because the majority of sex workers know that if something does happen to us, we can't report it. But pushing it underground isn't going to help. That's only going to put us at more risk. And not listening to us and how we feel about our job is also putting us at risk. Because the underlying assumption through all these things is that people think this isn't something I would do with my life, so therefore it doesn't make sense that this is something you would do with your life. Even though we're not the same people, we haven't come from the same place, we don't have the same experiences, we don't always have the same opportunities. So what I'm doing with my life is what I want to do, and I'm right now where I need to be. And I really wish that society would be more understanding and appreciative of that. I would really hope that when we talk about decriminalization, that people would choose to listen to us as sex workers because we understand the industry. We don't want to see human trafficking. We don't want to see people forced into the industry who don't want to be there. We don't want to see violence. We don't want to see sex workers getting killed. We want to end those things too, but the best way for the global society to end those things would be to listen to us, because we know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about, we live this, we do this, this is our job, we understand the nuances and all of the subtleties involved. So it's really, really important that society as a whole begin to recognize the agency of sex workers. It's really important that people begin to understand we know what we're doing and we have a voice. Just because society has become accustomed to ignoring our voice doesn't mean it's non-existent. Our voice is still there, and we know the kinds of things that we're talking about. We know what we want to do, and we know where we need to go. Again, for me, I just can't stress in my circumstances that this is definitely the right choice. And what upsets me is the assumptions. The assumption is I had a terrible childhood. The assumption is I'm a drug addict. The assumption is I had an abusive boyfriend who got me into this line of work. The assumption is, I have absolutely no opportunity to have a straight job. I do have opportunity to have a straight job. I just don't have the opportunity to have the time, scheduling flexibility, and the income that I need by doing a regular job. And, I am more than my stereotype, okay? I am non-white, I'm queer, I'm a single mom, I'm certainly not wealthy. That brings in a lot of stereotypes, and then you add in the sex worker part. But I am more than that stereotype, and I want to be treated as more than that stereotype. I'm not a rescue project. I don't need saving. I don't need rescuing. I'm perfectly capable of telling you what the best thing is for me, and what I really, really want to emphasize is I need society to be able to trust me and sex workers as a whole, to trust our community when we tell you the things that we need, okay? What we need is decriminalization, not legalization. We don't want any sort of system that criminalizes jobs like the Swedish model does. We don't want anything that's going to increase stigma against us. We don't want to promote the idea that we're all victims and we need saving. A lot of us are good where we are. And instead of judging us because it's considered to be the last job that anyone would ever do, because it's an awful job, no, we are people. And the vast majority of people where I live don't know what I do. And I help out with the PTA at my son's school, I'm a soccer mom. I baked 3 dozen cookies for their last, cookie sale at the school. I donate, I run charities, I do things. I am more than a sex worker, but once people hear that phrase, oh, you do sex work, it's all over. Everything else is gone. That's the only thing people know about me. And that's the kind of stigma that we really, really need to focus on ending, because that's the kind of stigma that gets people killed. That's the kind of stigma that leads to continual oppression of a certain group, because we've been dehumanized. Society has been very clear about saying that sex workers don't deserve the same protections as other women because we're sluts, because we're immoral, because no good woman, whatever good woman even means, would do sex work, because it's wrong for women to have sex, because it's wrong to earn money this way, because we're being exploited. No, that's not what it is. I'm still a well-rounded individual. I still do a million other things, but right now, sex work is the job that I need to ensure that I end up where I want to be. And I find it's a little bit disturbing when I hear critiques of sex work. Very few of them come from actual sex workers, and even fewer of them are from people who have spent real time talking to sex workers. Watching one documentary about human trafficking does not make you an expert on sex work. Being around one sex worker is not enough to be representative of an entire global community. But if you want to do the research and do the work, there's blogs, there's websites, there's all sorts of Twitter accounts of sex workers just being amazing and putting their voice out there and telling the world what we want and who we are and what we need. And what we need is the emphasis on listening to that, instead of listening to experts who have never spent time with sex workers a day in their life making policy. What we need is people listening to sex workers who are telling others that this is what we want and this is who we are, to respect that choice and to trust us that we know what we're doing, and to trust us to say that we should have the choice to do what we're doing. We should have the ability to work without fear. We should have the ability to report if something does happen, and we should have the ability to do what we do without being shamed by society. I think that's the important thing, and I think that gets lost a lot. So I would highly encourage everyone to ask lots of questions and to listen to the voices of sex workers. I mean, there are some amazing, brilliant, articulate people out there, because sex workers are not a monolith. I've seen sex workers that are, never graduated high school, who are illiterate, and there's sex workers that have PhDs. There are sex workers who are middle class, all genders, all races, all income brackets in every corner of the world. We are certainly not a monolith, but we all have the desire to be heard. So just please listen to us, okay? All right, I think that is my time. Unless y'all want me to rant some more, I can do that, but I think that's my time.
I think because of the way that the Skype set up, that we might have some time to set aside for you for questions now rather than click you off. So I wanted to see if there were any questions that anyone had for Phoenix.
Wow, you guys are so quiet though. Really? Nobody? Nothing?
Can we go back to it at the end?
We can.
Yeah, because then we have the whole perspective.
Was there a question here?
Yeah, I had a question, but I'm totally fine coaching it to the end. Which is fine.
It's up to you. Go ahead if you'd like.
You mentioned police and government, and I'm just interested if you could talk a little bit more about institutions and that sort of level that you're dealing with on a regular basis with police and that sort of stuff at all.
Okay. Well, I will specify again that my experience is coming as a non-white woman, and a lot of sex workers that I work with live in low-income urban areas in the city, and police brutality is a very real thing in those areas, especially for non-white people, especially for women. And a trend I've noticed when it comes to police, and this is one of my biggest reasons why I think decriminalization is better than legalizing, is it's common for police to go to an area where sex workers are known to be and use coercive tactics or coercive threats to basically blackmail sexual services out of sex workers. I've seen that happen, and I think that's horrific, and I think that's a huge abuse of power. And personally, I would worry if we were talking about the government regulating the industry, if that would maybe become more common, if that would be more of an issue. Because right now we're in a position where, you know, and I'm just gonna throw out a couple things. I don't think necessarily most people are aware. You say sex worker, most people think like, you know, like the crack whore. It's gonna be like a black or a non-white woman who's a drug addict and an abuse victim who's working on a corner. But the majority of sex workers are actually white, and most of them work in at least middle to higher income areas. It's not like the poor black woman in the ghetto. However, when you look at the arrest, over half of all arrests for sex workers are non-white. So, you know, I think there's something to be said for, you know, one of the things that white workers have generally is more ability to not be seen. It's harder to hide from police when you're actually working on the street itself. You're not doing like a escort call-in services. So that's an issue. I also think that police know, just with the way things have been racially layered in our society, that they can target certain ethnic groups and no one's gonna say anything about it. And of course the thing too is for all the arrests of sex workers, there's very, very few people who are arrested for purchasing services, which last time I checked is illegal too. So I'm not sure how we ended up in a system where most sex workers are white and there's a lot of clients, but the vast majority of people getting arrested and ending up in jail are non-white women, or especially trans women, which is also incredibly dangerous because there's nothing worse than putting a trans woman into a men's prison because we refuse to respect gender identities. So I mean, there is a lot of mistrust of police and any sort of institution that's coming in to help. Now couple that with certain rescue agencies, and I say that lightly, they're not really rescue agencies, coming in to help, and they're saying, no, but you're a poor black person and let us help you, and it's like this weird saviorism complex that's going on. So between police knowing that they can abuse us and government policies trying to protect us before hearing us, I have a huge mistrust of certain institutions actually ever doing anything beneficial for sex work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Phoenix, we're going to click off from you and go to Sabrina, so hold on.
Okay.
We just put you up on the screen. So this is Sabrina Morgan, who is also a sex worker who works in the Bay Area, and she works as a sex educator as well. And so why don't we go ahead and welcome her. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Thank you. My name is Sabrina Morgan. Some of you may also know me as Alex. I've been doing sex work since 2004, and I've been working in sex education since 2009. The work that I do has started off as phone sex work, distance work, and then switched over to webcam, then to queer pornography, then to face-to-face work as a fetish companion. So there have been very few types of sex work that I haven't had experience with. One of the things that I would really like to talk a little bit about is the difference in experience between work that is considered fully legal or that operates in a legal gray area and work that is criminalized under the current US system. And most types of face-to-face or hands-on sex work are at least partially criminalized, which means that anyone that wants to engage in either one-way or two-way touch is facing some type of criminal prosecution. This means that any sex worker who is working face-to-face with someone, whether they're working as a BDSM professional, such as a dominatrix or a professional submissive, someone who is doing sensual massage work, someone who is doing private dancing, someone who is doing escort work, every single one of these workers is affected by the criminalization of prostitution, because every single one of those forms of sex work can be targeted for prostitution convictions. And one of the effects that this has had on people is that street-based workers, who are some of the most vulnerable and have the least resources for turning down clients most often, don't have the luxury of having the time to negotiate safer sex, to use their gut sense to get a feeling of whether or not their client is a safe person to be getting in the car with, to let somebody know, hey, this is where I'm going to be, can you check in on me? Because they're having a split second to make that decision to get out of sight of law enforcement. This makes them remarkably less safe than they would be under a system in which they would be able to report crimes against them or to negotiate their safer sex needs without fear of arrest. It was only very recently in New York City that they stopped maintaining a policy of considering condoms that were found on someone who was stopped and frisked as evidence of prostitution. This was a practice that was tremendously humiliating for many people of color, many trans women who were typically the ones targeted, regardless of whether or not somebody was a street-based worker. This did affect them. And this is something that's still active in many parts of the country, including in DC. One of the questions that comes up a lot of times with this type of work is it empowering or is it something that's very oppressive? Specifically, that question is usually framed in terms of its impact on women. But I want to go ahead and be upfront and disclose that I am a trans sex worker. I've worked as someone who presents very femme. I've also worked as somebody who presents a little bit more masculine. And there are a lot of trans women sex workers. There are a lot of trans men sex workers. There are a lot of queer cis men working in sex work. There are a lot of non-binary trans people that are working in sex work. And so any question about sex work is often framed as a question about women's oppression. And sex work is an issue that's often stigmatized in ways that are very specific to women. But the oppressions that sex workers face are not unique to women, and not all sex workers are women. So with that said, this is not a question that one would ask of a male-dominated field. This is a question that we ask of sex work specifically because it is a field in which its most visible participants, and the vast majority of those participants, are female identified. It's also a question that is very specific to sex work because as a society, we are genuinely deeply uncomfortable with sex and with money. And when you have a profession that combines sex and money with the basic premise that anyone who is participating in this work has the right to charge for their sexual time, with anyone who is doing this work you're charging for your emotional labor, you're charging for your sexual labor because that is something that is not assumed, because that is something that is inherently has value. And for some people, working in that capacity is just groundbreaking, and it gives them the tools to set boundaries in other areas of their life that they wouldn't have had if they hadn't had an opportunity to work in this type of environment. And there are other people whose experience is very much that when you're working in this environment where you're sexualized based on things that are assumed about you, based on stereotypes relating to your age, your race, your gender, that is something that is uncomfortable, that makes it harder to engage with your individual sexuality when you're off the clock. Sex work is not a monolith. There are a variety of experiences. There are as many different types of experiences of sex work as there are sex workers. And different sex workers will have different experiences at different points in their lives. We have good days, we have bad days. But as with any other type of work, whether or not we have good days or bad days, whether or not we have more bad days than good days, doesn't change the fact that the most oppressive force that sex workers face is people telling us that regardless of our experiences of our work, regardless of the necessity that that work may be for us, regardless of whether it's a first choice or a last resort, that we don't have the competence or the agency to make that choice for ourselves. Even a difficult choice, even a choice that's made in hard circumstances, is a choice. And I think it's often very easy for those of us who've had more advantages, who've had more privileges in life, to say, if you didn't have as many choices as I did, if you didn't have the ability to go to college, to work a better job, to work off your feet, to work in a hands-off environment, then how are your choices real choices? And when we do that, oftentimes what we do is we dismiss the strength and the character of people who said, okay, these are the options that I have, I'm going to do the work that meets my needs. And that work may have difficulties, that work may have challenges, but I'm making the best choice that I can in a difficult situation. This is especially the case with youth sex workers. The vast majority of youth in the sex trades are homeless, are queer or trans, and are running away from abusive home situations. They are the very definition of making a desperate choice in a difficult situation. And there are very, very few resources that are safe to refer these people to. Working in a criminalized system adds an additional layer of challenges there. And that's why so often when you look into sex worker rights issues, one of the things that you come up with is the question of legalization versus decriminalization. And I'm going to go ahead and stop and define this because oftentimes we don't. When it comes to legalization, so often the argument that I hear every time I go to South by Southwest, for example, is, well, this is what we need to do with sex work. We should legalize it, we should tax it, and we should just test them, and we should do this, and we should do that. Very similar to the system that they have in Nevada. And the system that they have in Nevada, and I actually just got off the phone with a dear friend who just returned from working in the legalized system in Nevada. It's a very strict system in the sense that it denies the ability of workers to work independently. The brothels are controlled by, there's a limited number of brothel licenses. There are a limited number of business owners who have them. So this means that there are very few places where people can go to legally work. Once you go there and you are doing legal work, then your health status then becomes a matter of government record. Then your safer sex practices and the choices that you have around that are often something that is subjected to pressure from the houses. And there's the privacy and the independence and the ability to screen your own clients that independent sex workers value so highly is absent in legalized systems. Decriminalization is actually something that has been tremendously successful in New Zealand. They recently, I believe it was about 2 years ago, they did their 10-year follow-up study on the decriminalization of all forms of sex work in New Zealand. And what they found, they were expecting to see a spike in the numbers of people who were working as sex workers. What they found was that actually the numbers stayed about the same. They also noticed no increase in human trafficking numbers after making that decision, which was also interesting. There was a slight reduction, in fact. But what decriminalization is treating commercial sex like any other form of consensual sex, and not making the presence or absence of money something that changes how you have sex as an individual, as a human being. It has the radical notion that you treat sex workers like people who are capable of making their own sexual decisions. And it has been hugely successful. It has led to sex workers being able to take brothel owners to court for sexual harassment lawsuits and win. It has led to sex workers being able to organize politically in a way that is impossible here in the United States. It has led to sex workers being able to treat their work like work. One of the big pros of decriminalization is that all of the existing laws around sexual assault, around underage sex, around consent carry over. What it's doing is recognizing the fact that while money is a factor in the circumstances under which one might decide to engage in a sexual practice or not, everyone has their limit. There's always that hypothetical question, what's your price? What is the amount of money that you would need to sleep with such and such a person, to pose naked, to do this, to do that? And what you find when you ask people these questions is that there is always something that they won't do no matter how much they're paid. Always. Every single human being has that line. And that is an extremely strong indicator that money does not counteract consent. When anyone in any other industry goes to work, their money is a part of their consent. If you're not getting paid, you're probably not going to stay at your job very long. It's kind of an important thing. And it's much the same with sex work. But that said, the fact that you're being compensated, the value of your time is being recognized, does not invalidate your consent, it informs it. And I would love to hear your questions about this type of work, your questions about the systems that are out there, about decriminalization, about legalization, about sex workers' rights in general.
We can take one question if anyone has a question now.
I have a question. Can you see me? I don't know. Hi. So in brothels, in in places where it is legalized, do women actually have a choice in who their customers or who's coming up, and where is their power in that, in legalization areas in like Nevada?
In systems where sex work is legalized rather than decriminalized, typically women do have and all sex workers do have the ability to refuse clients. And there are typically conditions under which they are instructed to refuse clients. They may not have as much ability to control their marketing to bring in their ideal clients, but they typically have right of refusal and also the right of negotiation, which is crucial to having a satisfactory sexual experience, whether it's commercial or not. Thank you for asking.
Okay, so at this time, we can take some questions at the end here as we provide that, but I also wanted to give some time to Nicole von Gertmanton, Professor of History here at OSU. So Sabrina, hang on, I'll turn you over this way, and Nicole?
Sure. Do you want me to stand up?
If you don't mind.
I'll come up to the front.
Sure.
All right. All right, great. All right, is anyone still on that phone, or
So, Sabrina.
just me? Okay. All right, thanks to the amazing comments that we've been able to hear. They were really enlightening and so empowering, positive statements of personal agency and freedom that I really like. So there's really not much I can add to them, but I'll try. And I'm also coming from the perspective that in the reading that I've done on the modern sex worker movement, I've read that there has been a divide between academics and sex workers because of that 1970s and 80s radical feminism that was anti-sex. So traditionally there's really a divide there. Hopefully it's been broken down in recent years, but the idea is as a radical anti-sex feminist, there's no way that you can view any kind of compensated sex work as a personal choice. It's always going to be a victim of patriarchy, right? So it's not possible to choose this. So that's the kind of attitude that really alienated those two sides from each other. But as I said, maybe they're coming together. And I also wanted to, just in case there's anybody here, it seems like the audience is really well informed, but the idea of using the term sex work is a relatively new, I think it came around in the 70s from a particular sex worker activist out of Santa Cruz, if I have that right, California. And she used that term. The idea is focusing on labor, right? And by using this term prostitution, that's a term for a criminal act, right? That's saying you're a person who does a criminal act. It's not saying you're a person who engages in a physical performance, who has an exchange of sexuality for benefit for occupation. That's not what it's saying. So sex worker is kind of a more neutral term that I think is the best term that we have at the moment. Although I've read some books where there's a retaking of the word whore in the sense of positively. Like there's a book that I read that's Vindication of the Rights of Whores, right? Because the idea is, yes, that's what I am. You can call it negative, you can call it positive, but that's what the definition is. So there's also a lot of other more controversial terms, but sex worker seems to be a good one, I think. Just to clarify that, because I don't think either person totally clarified that. The idea is that so many jobs use your physical body, right? There's any number of jobs that use your physical body. Even a computer programmer uses their physical body. They're sitting in a seat, they're doing damage to their physical body. So by saying, well, one aspect of your physical body is going to give you the ability to not be a worker, not be a laborer, then that's just fueling into a patriarchal attitude that's the one sacred or fetishized aspect of your body, right? That cannot be regular labor. It has to be criminal, amoral behavior, right? So, and also the other idea of using a term like sex worker that's kind of gender neutral is that there's a lot of jobs that we wouldn't call quote unquote prostitution that are sex work because they play off of a gender role. They play off of femininity, right? People would say the old-fashioned flight attendant, the cocktail waitress, other people in the service industries, right? It would be quite naive, any kind of service industry that you can think of. It'd be quite naive to say that those people do not have a performance of their feminine behavior, of their physicality, of their manners that's distinctly feminine, that earns them, approval and reward in their jobs. So that's another thing to think about. That a lot of work is that women and perhaps men too do is sexualized, right? And it's not just one particular type of work that has to be just that. So I'm a historian and I'm working on a book project that has to do with sex work in the past, right? So the panel is called Sex Work in the Future, so obviously I can't, I'm not a science fiction writer, I can't say what's going to happen in the future, but when I'm talking about the past, obviously I'm thinking about my own values that have to do with the present day and the messages that I want to promote that have to do with the present day, even though I'm writing about from the 1570s to the early 1800s, so it's obviously a totally different time period. But my working thesis is really I'm trying to be in dialogue with this kind of activism that we've heard today, because the idea is that just like today, people in the past could make a distinction between the rhetoric, the moralizing rhetoric of sexuality and their day-to-day life decisions, and that was a clear distinction. So they could say, yes, I'm aware of the fact that I'm doing things that the church or the government or somebody who believes in these things is not going to put their official stamp of approval on, but every day I'm making a choice to do this, and it's right for me and it's right for a lot of the people around me. So that's a situation that I'm trying to argue and research in the past. And I just believe it because it's such a common occurrence that it obviously wasn't something unknown, just like the present. So going off of the comments that we heard, let me just check my time. I believe, as well as our speakers have pointed out, that the greatest two dangers faced by people in this industry is the socially imposed shame that comes from outside. So people acting in a negative way towards individuals. That is one of the greatest dangers, other than the dangers of it being a criminalized situation, as pointed out by our first speaker, that's where people face the dangers, is that they're considered criminals. So they will run into dangers, abuses within the police and what have you. And I'm not saying that there aren't dangers within the profession, but those are what scholars have noted are some of the most serious dangers. The dangers that cause a psychological and even physical damage is the idea of being treated being shamed by people, the idea of having that guilt. So the best way to lessen that is to make the conscious choice to say, I'm not going to be one of those people who imposes more of this shame and negative judgment, right? Because that's the danger. That's what's causing people psychological pain by being one of those people. I read an article that said, as a sex worker, if I'm being interviewed, I don't want you to ask me about my childhood, because don't make the assumption that I had this abused childhood. Don't make that assumption. Let's not start from there, right? It's just those little subtle attitudes, right? And this is a way, taking away a stigma, which is what each of us can do day to day by not creating this as a stigmatized thing, is how we can improve work conditions and emphasize the personal agency and choice involved here. And as I believe our first speaker was noting, that she noted in passing, in order to have a concept that any one of us is good and moral, we need to have a contrast. So if we say, oh, I'm a family person, I'm monogamous, I'm married, I have kids, etc., right? I feel really good about all those choices that I've made. We're saying implicitly, and I'm thinking about those non-monogamous people, right? Those people who aren't married, those nasty people, right? Without those people, maybe you wouldn't have that great confidence in how morally right you are. So we kind of need those people to make our own choices seem a little bit better, right? That's the thing where we have to have an opposing force to really believe in what we're doing, and that is, I think you can agree, rather disappointing, right? I would say. So, thing to think about. Let's see, check the time. Finish it up. Just one or two more thoughts. If you, as was noted by our speakers, if you look at this occupation constantly in a victimized sense, and you're talking about adult participants, as was just noted, we already have laws against rape, we already have laws against underage sex. All those laws are in place and they apply to everybody, right? But if you are constantly thinking, wow, we can't view people as making conscious choices, we mainly can't view women as making conscious choices, then you're always seeing women as underage. They're always minors. They're always not able to make a good choice for themselves. So is that really how we want to think of women? Another article I read said, this, you may disagree with this, but I think it had a point. If you think in your mind, if there were a man who was 30 years old and he sold sex, would you see him as like a poor, pathetic victim? I don't think you would. A grown man, but yeah, you'll say, wow, that 30-year-old woman must come from an abusive household. Because the idea is, the difference is, well, a woman must hate sex. The man, he's enjoying it. What man doesn't like sex? That's our normal assumption. But men have this hydraulic sexuality. They have to let it out. That's our assumption. cultural assumption, thousands of years old, but women, no, they're the opposite. You know, they can't do that. So when they're in that position, they must be victims. They must be something, some horrible thing happened to them. So that's an example of patriarchy in action. One last point is that, as I think both speakers hinted at, what we're talking about in recent years with the internet, the last 15 years or so, is a lot of sex work going quote unquote indoors. So since the 1990s or so, there's gentrification of cities all across the US, right? So places that used to be the strolls, right, are now, you don't see sex workers there anymore. But that does not mean that sex work is disappeared. It's gone indoors. It's contacted, people are contacted through the internet, right? So mainly the excuse for cleaning up the street has been gentrification. It has been built, business owners saying, I want this neighborhood cleaner and safer. That's the motivation, not morality. It's, oh, now we have this neighborhood, like Civic Center in San Francisco. Oh, now it's going to be a place where people can come with their families and there's, you know, corporate businesses there, so we don't want sex workers in there anymore. So just in case there was an idea that that's some kind of like elimination of sex work, I think that is not what has happened at all, and it's just a matter of repurposing city streets. And as our first speaker noted, there's still plenty of city streets that aren't considered worth cleaning up, and that's where people gather. They just move to another street. So I just want to add to that, I agree in conclusion that legalization is not a good answer. I have read that in the Nevada situation, that's also a heteronormative situation. So if you were a woman going into one of those brothels, you would be, from what I've read, you would be looked at as a bizarre creature. So it's only, you can only go in there as a man. It's a very heteronormative, stereotypical experience that you're going to get in those brothels, as far as I know, or in the mainstream. And so turning kind of into a corporate system there. So I just want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll just end it off there. So we have almost 10 minutes for questions. Thanks for listening. I'll stay up here, I guess, in case I can answer any questions.
So, questions?
Are there any moves in Oregon for decriminalizing sex workers? Or even in the United States, I guess, is it?
There are movements, but I think personally, from what I've read, and I would have the other speakers contribute, I don't think I think it's gone in the opposite direction. There's been, because the trafficking lobby is so powerful, you know, this is, the reason why that is not a good thing is because then, say if we want to go to another country and do something like AIDS education, it won't be done with sex workers because it's all, we can't touch that because it's all trafficking. So it's actually a very negative thing to promote as the main emphasis here. So I'm not sure, but I guess I take a little bit of a negative point of view. I think it's actually moving away. But the idea of toleration, I think, is pretty strong in Oregon. I mean, I really think, I don't know about street work, but I think in terms of indoor and obviously strip clubs and what have you, pretty tolerated. Not that persecuted at all, in my experience.
Sabrina, do you know anything about that? Do you feel whether or not there's any kind of movement towards decriminalization of sex work in the United States?
Successful.
There absolutely is. It's definitely something where the groundwork has been laid for the past couple of decades, and the sex workers' rights movement is really picking up steam in a big way, which is in part why there's so much opposition from the trafficking lobby, as mentioned. And that's a whole separate talk. But one really encouraging thing is that a porn performer in the Bay Area recently had her fundraiser taken down from a crowdfunding site for crowdfunding for medical bills because of her sex work. And there was a huge public outcry with a lot of mainstream media coverage. And they were actually pressured into making a public statement saying that they supported sex workers. This is not something that would have even been imaginable 10 years ago.
I saw a survey, like in places like San Francisco, I saw a survey where they surveyed the entire city, or whatever, people were surveying in San Francisco. Well over 50% of people said decriminalize it. But this is one particular city that might be not exactly the norm, but I think in cities like that could be the cutting edge. Like,
Yeah, see, we're so far away from that in Chicago. We just made sex work, arrest for prostitution, not a felony conviction anymore. So we are nowhere near that in Chicago.
Yeah, San Francisco, I think, is an extreme outlier when it comes to sex work.
Oh, sex work is absolutely still criminalized in San Francisco. To be clear, that's more, the only thing that has shifted there is public sentiment nationally on sex workers' rights. The criminalization movement in San Francisco, the trafficking movement in San Francisco are still tremendously strong, and there is active legislation on both the local and federal level to add new crimes to the books, to arrest sex workers and refer to that as anti-trafficking work so that they can use federal funds for vice stings.
We have a thing that I just happened to notice when I was doing a search on the internet. In our tiny town of 55,000 people, the police took the time to do a sting of John's in a local hotel, I think a year ago. You can look it up. So they used your taxpayers' resources, and they arranged a fake thing, and they had, so hopefully we're all happy about how they're using our resources there to arrest these guys. But yeah, so that's the same thing going on here in this little town.
Okay, so we'll go 1, 2, 3. Sure.
So talking about like decriminalization, I was just wondering on the subject of like, not sure if this is true for like all legal brothels. Like I think Nevada is the only place that has them.
In the U.S., yeah.
In the U.S.,
Right.
but I know that a lot of them like pay for the people that work there to be tested weekly, bi-weekly, or whatever. So like in terms of like decriminalization and like government resources, is there movements to like provide people with services for like condoms, things like that, like dental dams, other safe sex practices? Is that like kind of
There's an assumption here, and I hope you two agree with me, that people in sex work are not taking care of their own health, and that is a terrible assumption. If there's anybody, activists who are against it would say, then we should test every sexually active person, because STDs are passed by couples who think they are monogamous, and they're like, it doesn't matter, we're monogamous. That's how STD are passed. The sex workers are the people who are most careful about their health. That's why, that's an imposition.
Well, I guess what I was wondering is like,
Healthcare,
providing like the resources for the people to use to protect themselves rather than like.
Well, wouldn't that be with the nationalized healthcare? Right?
Okay, yeah.
That everybody should take advantage of, right?
I would also add in, there are various sex work orgs that already do this.
Yeah.
Like SWAP Chicago does it. We give referrals to low-income sex workers, oftentimes street-based, so that they can get work done. We do give away condoms. We do, help provide various services. So sex workers are already very much involved in doing these things because we understand the risk of our job. So yeah, I mean, decriminalizing wouldn't change any of that aspect. We would just keep doing what we're already doing, and we're pretty good at it, you know?
Absolutely. There is one benefit actually to decriminalization there, and that's that giving sex workers condoms, giving sex workers advice on how to do their job safely would no longer be considered trafficking. And so organizations like SWAP Chicago, like HIPS in DC, like St. James Infirmary in San Francisco would be able to do their jobs, would be able to provide that assistance without it then leading to street-based workers being targeted after they've accessed the van that has the supplies that they need for the evening.
Yeah.
And that is a huge problem in some areas. Yeah. So if anything, decriminalization would make it easier to provide those services to sex workers safely.
Yeah, in some places where there's legalization, if you are a babysitter who's babysitting for a sex worker's kid, so you take money, you'll be considered a pimp. Like there's so many weird things that get involved when you make it gray area or what have you. So it's so much better just to eliminate that.
I have one question. It's kind of long. So I'm interested in people's views on the concept of patriarchy and oppression with this whole topic, and whether people think that there is a place to talk about patriarchy and patriarchy's place in perpetuating oppression and violence against sex workers in particular ways. And when we talk about like multiple levels of systems, the legal system, prison industrial complex, welfare system, healthcare systems, nonprofit systems, those sort of levels, so like basically power, and you were just talking about like gentrification and classism and racism and all of that stuff. So talking about that in terms of patriarchy, but also talking about how whenever there is a system of power, there is also a system of resistance that is happening, and highlighting the resistance that sex workers are doing and the agency that they have to resist against these sorts of oppressions and violence in their lives. And if you think those conversations are possible to have to like bridge divides between people who are in these conversations nationally.
I think that's what people are absolutely trying to do.
Well, I think we should have those conversations because it is important to note what's going on a societal level, because when we're talking about patriarchy, it's how primarily it affects women. And I can't stress enough to people, like, as a sex worker, I'm having sex, which patriarchy tells me I'm not supposed to do. I'm financially independent, which patriarchy tells me I'm not supposed to do. And I'm doing things on my own terms, which patriarchy tells me not to do. So I view sex workers as empowered in that way because we are literally doing everything patriarchy tells us not to do. And I think that we should definitely talk about it because one of, if I could refer to sex workers as like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to patriarchy, because we have rejected the notion of women not being financially independent. We've rejected the notion of women not being able to have bodily autonomy. We've rejected the notion that women aren't allowed to be sexual. Because of that, I think that's why we have so much violence against sex workers. This is sort of a backlash of patriarchal values to essentially punish us. We've been labeled a class of acceptable victims in the eyes of patriarchy because we're doing everything that good girls aren't supposed to do. So, personally, I think that we, sex workers as a class, should have a little bit more appreciation for the fact that we are, in fact, defying patriarchy every time we get up and go to work. Because we're literally doing everything we're not supposed to do. And then, of course, we add in other systems too. It's, I talk to people outside of sex work and they don't understand where I'm coming from, but I know sex workers who are non-white women who work on the street, and people have a very judgmental attitude. I would never have sex with someone for $50. But here's the thing, we're talking about a very specific system in America that is intentionally marginalizing to women, it's intentionally marginalizing to people of color, it's intentionally dehumanizing and degrading. So as a non-white woman, she might not have the same chances and opportunities other people have, and yet, despite that, she has figured out a way to see maybe 4 or 5 clients a day and make triple what she would make if she was working a straight, legitimate minimum wage job. So instead of appreciation for like, wow, she got that hustle figured out, society is more like, yeah, we're not even gonna put it in the paper if someone kills her. Like, that's what's happened. And I think that is a direct result of patriarchy because it's perfectly acceptable under patriarchal values to use force, to use sexual violence, and to use murder to punish women who refuse to step in line. And sex workers are on that front line all the time, always have been. And hopefully we can stop that.
Yes. Well said. You covered that so well. I just have one quick thing to add, which is that sex workers are some of the most active people that I know when it comes to examining both patriarchy and hierarchy, because so much of what we do is navigating these systems of power and the ways in which we are viewed as benefiting from them, the ways that we're viewed as being outside of them, the very real ways in which we are set up as acceptable victims and as traitors. We are considered to be targets, considered to be enemies, considered to be disposable, rather than being what we are, which is the canaries in this coal mine that say, hey, this is a messed up system, and here are these people on the edges of this system getting beaten down by this system who are saying, no, you can't control my body, you can't control my dignity, you cannot force me to engage with you emotionally. I will demand value for my time, and I will set the rules under which my body operates. That is courage that every single one of us should have access to every day.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Sure. Well, so since we're talking about the future of sex work, I was curious to know what the end objective to the sex worker movement would be. Is it decriminalization, or does it go beyond the end of social stigma, or does it go beyond that? I was just kind of curious to see what your thoughts of the future of sex work really is, or what it should be. Anyway.
That is a fantastic question. I think that decriminalization is a powerful end goal in the service of moving towards a world in which sex workers are treated with full respect and dignity, in which they have the same rights as any other person, in which their profession is treated as a profession rather than an embarrassment, rather than an excuse to do harm.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I think that what I would really love is for the stigma to be gone, to be able to say what I do and not get judged for it. And for sex workers around the world to be like, yeah, this is what we do, and not have to worry that they have just invited danger on themselves, or that they're going to be targets for violence, or that, God forbid, something does happen, it's going to be, the crime will be investigated, and society will react to it the same way they would react to anybody else who ended up being the victim of a crime. You know, that it's not going to be dismissed and swept under the rug, and it doesn't matter because it was a sex worker. I just want us to be treated like everyone else.
Yes. The decriminalization and the full humanization of sex work and sex workers. I think that's the goal.
It's pretty good.
All right. Well, we're run out of time. Let me say thank you very much to you all, the audience. Thank you very much, Phoenix and Sabrina and Nicole. I appreciate especially your time in Skyping in. We'll be in touch with you. And for you all in the audience, if you would like to continue this conversation, please come check out the AnarisProject.org website. We hope in the future to have Sabrina and Phoenix both speaking there, and you may be able to interact with them through comments on our website. So we'd appreciate that sort of feedback. So let me say thank you once again to all the panelists, and thank you all. Let's give everyone a round of applause.